A delicate and complex ecosystem fraught by the push and pull of political attitudes, global debates on migration, and intricate networks of power, a border community is unique, vibrant, and complex. Here, art flourishes as both creative expression and a timely call to action. Artists challenge us to reimagine our world as a place where many realities may coexist, inviting us to investigate what exists between and beyond the wall. Legal advocates strive to impact the evolution of relationships at borders and improve the movement of people and ideas. California Lawyers for the Arts presents its 4th annual binational symposium, Intersections, Art and Law at the Border. Each year we invite artists, activists, lawyers, scholars, and researchers within the San Diego and Tijuana region to contribute their unique perspectives and expertise on various border topics at the intersection of art, praxis, and legal issues. The symposium will occur the entire month of June and will be presented as a series of weekly virtual webinars. We are particularly excited to have the opportunity to celebrate with an in-person closing reception hosted by the Front Gallery in San Isidro on Thursday, June 30th. To register and for more information, please visit our website at www.calawyersforthearts.org. We hope you will join us for another year of insightful conversation, community building, and connection.
Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Diana Cervera, and I am the Program Manager for California Lawyers for the Arts San Diego. Myself, along with Vanessa Quintero, who is the co-organizer for this event, along with members of our statewide staff, such as our Executive Director, Alma Robinson, and our Deputy Director, Gloria Ruiz Oster, are happy to welcome you to our 4th annual binational symposium, Intersections, Art and Law at the Border. Each year we invite artists, activists, lawyers, scholars, and researchers to contribute their unique perspectives and expertise on various border topics, with a focus on issues affecting the geopolitical context of the Tijuana-San Diego region. The intention of this gathering is ultimately to highlight the work of those responding to border issues precisely at the intersection of art, praxis, and legal issues. Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Diana Cervera. Soy la gerente de programación con California Lawyers for the Arts aquí en San Diego. Estoy acompañada por Vanessa Quintero, nuestra coordinadora basada en Los Ángeles. Y también estamos acompañadas por nuestra directora ejecutiva, Alma Robinson, y nuestra directora del sur de California, Gloria Ruiz Oster. Les damos la bienvenida al 4º año de nuestro simposio binacional Intersections, Arte y Derecho en la Frontera. Cada año invitamos a artistas, activistas, abogados, académicos e investigadores dentro de la región de San Diego y Tijuana a contribuir sus perspectivas y experiencias únicas acerca de temas fronterizos. I greet you today as a visitor residing on the occupied lands and ancestral territories of the Kumeyaay Nation, past, present, and future. As we begin our conversation today, it is important to note that the Kumeyaay territory, also known as the San Diego and Tijuana region, extends across the current U.S.-Mexico border, along the Pacific Ocean from Oceanside, California to San Vicente, Mexico, and extends to the east from the Salton Sea to the Laguna Salada, including the places now called Tijuana, Mexicali, Tecate, San Diego, and Escondido. As a guest, a visitor, and a person who occupies a place in these lands, I extend my respects and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples who reside here and call these lands their home. Once again, thank you for being here with us this evening. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors of this year's event, which include the San Diego City Commission for Arts and Culture and the San Diego County Community Enhancement Program. Also, the Los Angeles Department of Arts and Culture and the County of Los Angeles for their support of this program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with California Lawyers for the Arts, we are a statewide nonprofit organization serving the arts community by providing a number of legal and educational support services. To tell you a bit more about our organizational history and services, I'll play a short video from our Executive Director, Alma Robinson, and then we'll begin our program.
Hello, my name is Alma Robinson, and I am the Executive Director of California Lawyers for the Arts. CLA is a statewide nonprofit organization that was founded in 1974 to serve artists and arts organizations of all disciplines with advocacy, as well as services that provide support with legal and business issues. With staffed offices in San Francisco, Berkeley, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego, we provide several core services. First, we provide legal counseling to specialized attorneys who provide assistance with a variety of intellectual property questions, as well as contract reviews and negotiations and other important business issues. Depending on the client's financial status, legal assistance may be available on a pro bono or reduced fee basis. We also provide a specialized program that assists independent inventors and small startups with their patent applications. To help with situations involving disputes, we provide a range of alternative services, including negotiations counseling, mediation, and arbitration that can avoid the expense and hassle of going to court. Finally, we offer a full menu of educational programs that include workshops, symposia, and conferences on various legal topics for artists and arts organizations. Many of these programs are posted on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to use these tools to educate yourself on the legal issues before you reach out for specialized assistance from our organization. Thank you for joining today's program, and please consider joining CLA on our website at www.calawyersforthearts.org so that we can continue to maintain our full range of services. Thank you.
If you don't already, please take a moment to screenshot this slide and follow us on social media to keep updated with our programs and services. And Vanessa, if you'd like to come up and quickly highlight our centerfold photo.
We would like to take a quick moment to highlight this year's centerfold photo by artist Gustavo Vargas. Vargas took this photograph in 2018 at Playas de Tijuana on the shores of the Pacific. In the photograph, a son joracho dancer climbs the stage to dance to one of the songs played in the musical style of Veracruz. The dancer is part of the Jaranero community of the border, which hosts the Fandango Fronterizo event each year. During this sun festival, the sound of jaranas and songs about politics, migration, and struggles are able to cross the wall erected between Tijuana and San Diego.
Great, and without further ado, I'd like to begin our panel, Overseas Perspectives. The construction of borders has historically been accompanied by ideologies of exclusion, which serve to cement, fix, and protect an imagined nation-state. Tonight's panel will explore various historical and present-day perspectives on migration, coloniality, and citizenship within the context of the Caribbean. Panelists will explore the history of colonialism and the theme of borders by examining art practices and social movements specific to Haiti, Puerto Rico, Dominicana, which aim to disrupt colonial violence and amplify resistance movements. And Vanessa, if you'd like to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Diana, for the panel overview introduction. Our first panelist is Sherazade Garcia, who is a painter, printmaker, and installation artist whose work often explores allegories of history, migration, collective, and ancestral memory, and cultural colonization and politics. A co-founder of the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica, she holds an AAS from Altos de Chabón School of Design, a BFA from Parsons School of Design, the New School, and an MFA from the City College of New York. Garcia has been featured in solo and duo exhibitions at the Art Museum of the Americas, Clifford Art Gallery at Colgate University, Miller Theater at Columbia University, Lehman College Art Gallery, Crossroads Gallery at the University of Notre Dame, Museo de Arte de Santo Domingo, and others. Sherazade has a video for us, and Diana will go ahead and screen it for us.
Thanks, Vanessa.
First, I would like to say thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity of sharing my work with all of you. Now, I'm going to explain why I started with that piece. A little bit about my work. My work is rooted in history and storytelling. This Caribbean story conveys victory, failure, resistance, resilience, bravery, and treason. And there is always this thing, the hope for a happy ending that seems forever in exile. So my work somehow is always navigates really in the waters of beauty and tragedy. And I am always searching for some kind of historical healing. And in my search, what happens is that search allows me to build, to invent, to imagine new scenarios. So the words that I selected for this presentation are basically from the Caribbean, and they are this specific one that is Sabana de la Mar. It is the case that has to do with the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and then there is other pieces that are with the case of Dominican Republic and Haiti, La Isla La Española that used to be together. Now we are separated by two nations. So the first thing I want to show, and the title kind of tells a lot about how I think, and it's this idea that is this need to heal, is this need to understand and to find ways to find a balance. So how I work is that everything that I do starts with drawings. I read a lot, I watch the news, I listen to people, I have conversations, and that's exactly what happens before I start this project of Sabana de la Mar. But before Sabana de la Mar, I was in my studio. So I started doing these drawings, and in this case, what you can see here, these drawings, is all about this whole concept that I always have that the Caribbean is a continent, and the idea of unite the Caribbean with these inner tubes, like almost like bridges in between these islands, and then when they are all together floating, it becomes a continent, that can then, be part of the continental America. And also says a lot about, my own Caribbean experience. It is that I feel pan-Caribbean. I am a little bit Puerto Rican, Cuban, from Curacao, you name it, and also, connection with the French islands. And if you can start understand the history of the Caribbean, and when I talk about this whole chaos, but all this chaos that is also beauty, it makes sense that I am always navigating between this beauty and this tragedy. So then these drawings develop to things like this. These are inspired completely by the experience of the Cubans, especially in the 90s. These pieces that I show you, the Sabana de la Mar, was in 2002. These ones here, that is installation, video installation with sculpture, and they were from 1998, 1999. And these are the ideas of my inner tubes that are supposed to be floaties. These floaties, these inner tubes, are also part of the raft that the Cubans and the Dominicans used to cross, Cubans to Florida and the Dominicans to Puerto Rico, to be able to reach USA land. But my whole idea, and then how whimsicality comes to it, is that I always feel like there is all these hidden agendas that are way innocent, but they are not. So I always play a lot with the stories of Disney, stories that are constantly bombarded, you are bombarded by in the news, that all of a sudden they come afloat in my work. In this case, it's like I thought. Pinocchio wanted to be a boy, but my inner tubes that float and are float, they wanted to be both. And that's what, was the outcome of my watching of all this news of these Cubans trying to cross these waters, like the Dominicans also to Puerto Rico. So this was the inspiration of this piece. I use also what I call the politics of inclusion and the politics of confusion as well. And I'm going to tell you why. And when you see color, and, you like the way we add to it. If you see red, it's easily then you're going to think about can be religion, can be love. There are so many meanings to that color. But if we see pink, most likely there are two things. Can be candy, or it can be the voice of a woman, of a baby girl. And the moment I want to talk about something that is actually hard and actually is a struggle and is tough, I like to use colors that will completely put you off, because that's the way that I engage the viewer, by playing something that sounds and seems innocent, but but then when you are already engaged in the conversation, you realize, you are into a deep historical subject. So I use the same thing in the next piece, and I wanted to show you, this is the new version of that one that was presented 2 months ago at the museum at William Patterson's University Gallery. And these are the big lightsabers that you're gonna see also how that happened. These big lightsabers I made, they are also part of that whole series that comes just before Sabana de la Mar. And it's pieces that are enormous, and I use them and I basically compose them, and they are like altars, like when you go to church. So I play with the iconography of Catholicism, but in a very different way. But I mount these pieces that they are for going to pray. And it's specifically because it was part of this whole thing of like how to find salvation, that it was spiritual, but it also was practical, because these people and the idea of my borders and frontiers were over water. So it's always this idea that we have to float to be able to move to the other point. So in here also I use something that it becomes very important in my work, that is the angels and the Catholic iconography, but always a iconography that becomes completely brown. It comes mulatto. It comes with this idea of the mestizaje, which to me is the most important, one of the most important part of our Caribbean and our Las Americas experience. And then that takes me to the community. While I was inspired by all this and by reading all this book, by listening to conversations, by talking to people, there is a need for these ideas to kind of get new wings. And it comes from one idea, from drawings, paintings, installation, like you saw. And then I had this need to actually become like close to that community that inspired me, the community that I want to understand. And these photos here are production photos from Sabana de la Mar, the video that you just saw. Sabana de la Mar is an area in the Dominican Republic that is in the northeast of the island, very close to Puerto Rico. And many of these illegal trips that are organized out there in that area, Sabana de la Mar, Niche, Nagua, and the idea is to get to this beach in Puerto Rico, and it calls Anaso. And these cases, they still happen, but in the early 2000s, it became like something from the everyday. And what happens to this project is that, what I love at least, it is that you come with these very, preconceived ideas of what is good for the people, what you think you're going to find, or that. And I have this idea. But the thing is that what is wonderful, actually, it is that we can talk a lot, we can read a lot, we can discuss a lot from the very comfortable sofa in our homes. But the moment you go to a place and you allow yourself to witness a community, and then kind of like really then change, your script, because the experience is not leading you. The idea and the care that you have for the situation is there, but you get closer to some kind of truth, when you actually allow yourself to be open and listen and witness the community. And that is exactly what happened to me. And this is what I enjoy so much, to show how one thing can go from one point, from drawing in a sketchbook, to actually meeting people and a community. And in this case, I went with the idea of creating this factory of lightsabers in the beaches of where all these trips were organized. And the moment I got there, my first, step of this game was like, I do have to get people to trust me. I cannot be there and just say, oh, I am an artist, I am doing this, oh, you have to like me. No, there is a process of like how, we can go and have these questions that are personal, and many times, they are stories that are hidden. So what I found when I went to Sabana de la Mar and we stayed like a week, it was that everybody was involved in these trips. And it was kind of like a secret, and it was out loud. The tragedy of it is that there is a sense of secrecy all the time, and it's really, everybody was involved but in two sides. It's different ways, different levels. There was a business, of abuse creating for people from there, that they realized they were able to capitalize in the desperation of people. So they were people that, like the captain in the video, that the business was to sell these tickets to these boats that only in a good day day, they can take maybe 5 or 10 people the most, and they sell these tickets for a space for maybe in that time was $1,500 a piece, and they will get 50 people to cross El Canal de la Mona. The Mona Channel is what divides basically 80 miles that divides that area, the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico. And it's a channel, it's a canal, so it's infected by sharks. These boats are like not able to take so many people, but these people are in desperation. So many times they actually cross and no problem. The problem usually happens when they go to Puerto Rico and the police is there. But many times there were these tragedies, and many tragedies happen constantly. So my idea was to go there to create these lifesavers. I used materials that I found in the town. It was hard for me, but I found pink, and I used fabric that is umbrella fabric, so it's waterproof. And then the phone that I use is the phone that is used for coolers, to keep the drinks cold. So everything it was kind of in the area. So everything kind of was part of the whole experience. But what I found was that at the end of the day, I understood completely, that these people, I couldn't, just say you cannot cross. You cannot cross because I think that's bad, or because you're not gonna find a better life. It was a journey, and something that is part of the history of who we are as people. People that going from one place to another, that move from one place to another. So at the end, what I did was like to collect by stories, and you can see in the video how everybody got this best, and I would draw these drawings of the stories they were telling me orally. I will also be recording, but it became a send and receive where I was completely involved as they were. So we were completely kind of giving each other experience, and a moment of learning. And at the end, what happened to this was like we decided to kind of let the lifesavers go to see if they by themselves, by the weight of the wave, they will reach Puerto Rico. This is Elvis, who thought that basically, the boats were the airport because his parents, were successful in coming and back and forth from Puerto Rico without any accidents. So he was a leader, but he understood a little bit of so he, you can see him there. And the older people, they didn't want to be on camera, so I respected that, but they were some of the best stories. So the younger people, many of them that have brothers that die in a tragedy, or then they have family, or themselves, they've been back and forth. And then I'm going to jump to another piece, and how it started is the situation with the division of the island. Coming from the Caribbean, like I said before, my frontiers are always water. So always I think, and how I see the water is like, I don't even call the Atlantic or the Caribbean anymore. I call it the liquid highway, because it's kind of like an obstacle and a via. So it's always like this idea of like, we're going to float or we're going to go to the next place. But in the case of La Española, now Haiti and Dominican Republic, it's different. It's the same island, but also our history is very intertwined. And in 2003, just after Sabana de la Mar, I was fascinated by the history of Lili, Ulises Heros, who was Haitian and Dominican, but he became, and this is only the Caribbean, we got these two words together, beloved dictator. Okay, this dictator in a very racist country, black, with a very French last name, meaning that he was from the other side of the island, became one of the most important politicians that defined in many ways the modernization, and really the beginning of the industrialization of Dominican Republic. Super interesting how that happened. And I felt that the whole history of Ulises Heros, Lili, as we call it, that was his nickname, it was exactly what I wanted to talk about. It was like when that history is intertwined, and it is not like, I feel like I love the Haitians or I love the Dominicans together. No. This is observation, look, facts. This is a character that represents both sides of the island. And even though he was Dominican, the history is intertwined. And then I play with that to start the other word that took me to a way more contemporary case than it was the massacre order. And these are like all the stories that I do about dictators and the lottery of history, how we don't have any control of it, but everything comes around. So then I get to this project, and it's the memory postcard, and I call it Memory of Perejil. And basically what it was like I said before, it was inspired by the massacre. The massacre was in 1937, ordered by the then dictator, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, who, by the way, also has ancestral in Haiti. So you see, it's always this intertwined history. So this is not the first massacre. We have other massacre by the Haitians, then it was called the massacre of Moca. That was way before this one. But this one was very representative because it's contemporary. It's 1937. So it was a moment, where Trujillo needed to kind of like establish his power and to kind of be okay with the elite of the white politicians in Dominican Republic, and he needed it. So basically what he did, it was like for almost 10 days, everybody that looked Haitian was killed. And the outcome of this was like, it seems that everybody has like a different amount, but it seems that it were from 8,000 people to 10,000 people, and that's a lot around that time. But the thing is that many of these people that look Haitians were also Dominican. So therefore, the effect of this massacre was not only the killing of the Haitians, it's an event that really affected both sides of the island. We are affected because we are part of this island and we feel guilty by what happened and connected to the suffering, and especially because the frontier feels like a third country, like the people from the frontier are usually mixed and they speak both languages. And then what I decided to do, and that was 2012, it was to create this postcard. And I went with a group, Borders of Light, and it's a group of scholars from NYU, from CUNY, and me, and Julia Alvarez, the writer. So we all were there, and basically we met at a park that was basically the territory in between, which I think is also very interesting because I love these in-between situations. And then we basically, engaged everyone that was passing by, and that we started calling people, and people, hey, when you start a conversation, people can, hey, what are you doing? Hey, this and that. And that's how we engage the people. And then the question was to write, what they told you about the massacre. And I decided to say, cuéntame qué te contaron. What did they tell you about the massacre? It was because many of these people were already dead. So it's something that people tell the next generation. So what we found was like, it was an array of very racist opinions, extremely hopeful ones, and others ones that they just really were not sure about it. And then after all these postcards were finished, we decided to install it like it was like, when we dry in the laundry, like the only way to confront this tragedy was to basically confront the tragedy, and we all kind of have this wall, that it was a wall, it was a division, but it was also a way to bring in, to confront, to have a conversation. So there was a part that you could see the images of these two faces, and the other part that was just like the outcome of the stories that people told on those postcards. I'm just gonna show you photos, and then after that, I'm just going to stop. There is other projects, portraits also at the border, just to show them how our color, who we are, how diverse we are. It was a way to fight racist behavior at the frontier. Also, how I invent and kind of transform the geography. Thinking, the two countries are two swimming pools, and then we are, instead of water, it's like, a jungle, sketches of how I think. The liquid highway, that is basically completely inspired by the Atlantic, and the idea of the crossing of the Atlantic and what happened. We are the outcome, and how that those waters carry our DNA, and they, full of our ancestral collective memory. So I'm gonna leave it right here, but it's gonna give you, kind of idea than how I work. And this is the interactive liquid highway, where I basically, what I did was make enormous prints on rubber, no linoleum cut, but it was like rubber, the same material that you use for the inner tubes to float. So what I did was like, I kind of tattooed the water. I made many of them, and in this case, I showed 3. They are like endless stories. That's what I put in like a Chinese scrolls. And then in the show, in the exhibition, everybody was able to have a souvenir of a little piece of that liquid highway, that water that belongs to all of us, and it's collective memory. But by taking a souvenir, by doing your own print, you kind of tackle the personal one. So I'm gonna stop right here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sherizade, for sharing with us about your work and how it references references migration, politics, and colonization.
Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Our next panelists are Jose Fuste and Jade Power Sotomayor. Jose Fuste is an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. He writes about Hispanophone Caribbean migration, politics, and culture, and is currently completing a book manuscript titled Entangled Crossings, Afro-Latino Migrations Between Race and Empire. Jade Power Sotomayor is a Cal Rican educator, scholar, and performer who works as an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at UC San Diego. Her research looks to Latinx dance and performance as critical sites for understanding how Latinx people strategically navigate and move amongst differently racialized and gendered codes of belonging. We look forward to hearing more about both of your work.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful, Sherazad. I think what we're going to do is I'm basically just going to give you guys the context for Jade's part because she's the theater, dance, and performance professor, and I'm the ethnic studies professor that deals more with history and politics and all that. And Sherazad, you actually framed this really well for where we want to take this because first of all, I wanted to emphasize something that you touched on, which is that Puerto Rico is not just a colony, but it's also a border space, right? And normally when we think of borders, because of our proximity to it here, we think of the US-Mexico border. We don't often think of the Canada border, even though it's humongous compared to the US-Mexico border. But even less so, we think of these liquid borders, as Sherazad was talking about. The distance between Punta Cana and Rincon, which is actually where Jade is from, is quite short. It's only 70 miles. You can think of this border space in a square way because there's traffic of commodities, especially illegal commodities, and also immigrants, right, across this vast square, right? So even though it's 70 miles wide, there's quite a bit of area in square miles. It's also extremely treacherous. If you've ever been on a boat in the Mona Passage, there's some ginormous waves. We won't get into the specific reasons. Let's just say that there's one of the second deepest trench in the entire planet is north of that passage, and there's another deep trench underneath. So when that water collides through that passage, it creates quite a bit of turbulence. And just to give you an idea of what that distance is roughly the distance between San Clemente, the second border crossing over here on our way to Los Angeles, and also San Isidro, right? There's other important liquid borders, especially between, for example, Cuba and Key West, but that one is a little bit wider, 90 miles. But I wanted to begin there because I want us to frame the situation in Puerto Rico as a colony through this lens of a border space. I think I'm glad that was kind of the theme that we were given, because oftentimes people in Puerto Rico themselves don't talk about the island as a border space within the capitalist geopolitical system that we live in and also within the US empire. There's a little bit of press coverage on it. There was some press coverage this week, unfortunately, because there have been some recent deaths of Haitian immigrants crossing. It's impossible to calculate the amount of people that die crossing the Mona Passage because a lot of them are never detected, right? But of the ones that are detected, it could be 80, 100 a year. So if you think of the US-Mexico border having 500, 600 deaths a year, it's quite a bit. It also varies drastically year to year. And we see a similar situation also where there's a lot of drug importation through that border because the Colombian cartels, not the Mexican cartels, have always shipped drugs to the Puerto Rican coast and now recently the Dominican coast. And then from there, they try to import it to Puerto Rico so that then it can be taken on ships or planes to the US mainland or for local consumption in Puerto Rico. Those cartels are also involved in smuggling of immigrants, like the border over here. It's part of their portfolio. So there's quite a bit of a power differential. There's quite a bit of militarization. There's quite a bit of criminalization. It's very racialized criminalization because even though there's tons of Afro descendants in Puerto Rico, right, there's always the perception that our Antillean neighbors, west and east, are blacker, right? And that is also something very common in this particular phenomenon of power differentials across borders in the Antilles, right? The racializing of the foreign other as not just foreign, but blacker, right? Recently, there have been quite a number of Haitians. So Haitians have surpassed Dominicans in terms of the national composition of people going through this border. border, right? And this is one of those boats. Nosotros decimos yola. Yola is the word that Dominicans use. This is important to those over here because oftentimes we don't think that not all Latinx folks are Mexican or Central American. Puerto Ricans are actually the second largest Latinx group in the US, and Dominicans are the fifth, although in the East Coast, Dominicans are the third largest. Place matters, of course. So this is where Dominicans tend to live in the US, and this is where Puerto Ricans tend to live. It also matters to California because there's a rising number of Puerto Ricans in California and in the Southwest. So this is how I want to frame this, right? I want us to think about the border literally and metaphorically, because what is actually going on with a border, right? It's a arbitrary demarcation of differentials of poverty, differentials of wealth, right? It's a artificial demarcation of bordered vulnerabilities to state violence, right? Versus who gets to be secured or protected, right? There's differentials in terms of the corruption that people have to deal with in terms of government, because wherever there's socioeconomic inequalities, there's also corruption and also vulnerability to that corruption. There's also differentials in terms of the illusion of constitutional law and order, right? So in Puerto Rico, we tend to think that there's more constitutional law and order in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis, for example, DR or Haiti, even though there's tons of corruption and irregularities in governance in Puerto Rico. But at the same time, there are states of violation of law and order in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis the US mainland, but also there are states of permanent or seemingly permanent continuous exceptionalism in the way people are treated, right? So you have to think also of multiple borders and multiple demarcations of that differentiation, right? There's these internal borders to the Antilles, but there's also borders vis-a-vis the United States, right? And this is kind of a convoluted way in which I drew this, but you can think of the borders between these Antilles and the US, right? And also regions, we tend to think also of the Hispanophone, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean as very distinct to Anglophone or Francophone, even though we have very similar histories, and also the migrations across these divides, right? And what happens to people when they migrate across these divides? What happens to people when they migrate from Puerto Rico to the US mainland versus what happens to Dominicans when they migrate to Puerto Rico and from Puerto Rico to the US mainland, or Haitians to the Dominican Republic? So hopping along, right? There's a kind of food chain here. There's a kind of very variegated worthiness of human life vis-a-vis law, vis-a-vis state violence, right? There's also in the particular border between DR and Puerto Rico, right? There's this idea that Puerto Rico is a privileged space vis-a-vis the rest of the Caribbean or Latin America because of its status as a US Commonwealth, right? But there's also the reality within Puerto Rico about its constitutional exceptionalism and the differentiated unworthiness when it comes to the protection of life, liberty, property, and happiness, right? And this is a divide that is, I called it a veiled boundary because borders also can veil certain things, right? For example, San Diego might seem like a gilded place as seen from playas de Tijuana, right? But once migrants are at the other side, they might also see it as a kind of jaula de oro, right? To borrow that phrase from Los Tigres del Norte, that corrido band, right? You might think of Puerto Rico in a certain way if you haven't lived in it, especially if you're coming from DR or Haiti. But when you live there, you know that life is difficult, and it's especially difficult for those immigrants, right? So the difficulties of Puerto Rican colonial extra-constitutionality, underdevelopment, insecurity are certainly compounded for immigrants, right? And this is also similar to this idea of the 100-mile border zone, which has been recently further validated in federal courts, right? Except that in Puerto Rico, it just applies everywhere, right? So I won't get into much of the details of this because the details are very interesting and important, but we don't have much time for that. But you have to think of Puerto Rico, as in a continuous state of constitutional exception because of the insular cases, because of the different nature of U.S. citizenship in Puerto Rico as tied to the territoriality of Puerto Rico, but also this continuous and necessary official gaslighting of people, right? In terms of convincing them that the status is great, that they are privileged, right? That they are privileged vis-a-vis other parts of the hemisphere, that they are privileged vis-a-vis other Latinos in the U.S., etc. And without getting into the weeds of it, there are 5 formal overseas colonies. There's tons of territories that don't have populations in them, which appear in this map, but there are 5 that have significant populations. And I tend to think of them in 3 clusters. There's the Caribbean cluster, which has Puerto Rico and the USVI. There's the Micronesian cluster, which has the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam. The majority of the populations there are Chamorro, right? So it's a particular kind of Pacific Islander indigeneity. And then there's also further south in Melanesia, there's half of the island of Samoa, which is American Samoa, right? And they have different statuses. PR and Northern Marianas are Commonwealth, so they have a little bit more autonomy. USVI and Guam are organized territories. They have citizenship there if they're born, like in PR and Northern Marianas. American Samoa is an exception to an exception because it's an unorganized territory. So people born there are not even considered U.S. citizens. They're considered U.S. nationals. And that has also been recently validated by the Supreme Court. The entire reason why this exists, why there is this variegation of entitlements to constitutional rights, etc., is not because it was written into the Constitution, not because Congress passed laws that coded it that way. It was because the Supreme Court in the early 20th century, when these territories were acquired through U.S. imperialism, they devised a whole jurisprudential architecture for creating this, right? And you have 2 generations to the Supreme Court. The second generation, interestingly, was headed by Taft, because Taft, after he was president, he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But Taft also made his career in the administration of these colonial territories before he became president. And the court is the one that created this distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territory. And it basically means likely to become a U.S. state versus unlikely to become a U.S. state, or rather unworthy of becoming a U.S. state. So, for example, in 1902, they deemed Hawaii to be an incorporated territory because of the amount of settlers that were there. It was understood that there were so many settlers in Hawaii that it was likely going to become a state. Whereas these other places, remember that the Philippines was a colony for 46 years, too, of the United States, and there were other colonies in the Pacific. These other places were unincorporated. By the way, this recently came out. Justice Gorsuch, who's very conservative, in a recent opinion, blasted the insular cases and called them completely against the grain of the Constitution. And he even called them racist, right? But the Supreme Court doesn't want to take the step of legislating from the bench yet again. They created this status from the bench in 1901 and in the early 1900s, but they don't want to change it because they understand that the implications would be drastic, right? And this is from the oral arguments in a case from 2016, also pertaining to the status of Puerto Rico, where Stephen Breyer is interrogating the lawyer and basically says, well, how should we rule? Because if we rule this way, that has huge implications. And if we rule that way, it has huge implications. And it was very clear that they were tiptoeing around not massively overturning the insular cases because of the implications that it would have on the ground. So this has very significant repercussions in Puerto Rico, and I will go through them very quickly so that Jade has time. Massive government budget crisis, right? And in order for you to understand how big of a deal this is, Puerto Rico completely ran out of the ability to borrow money, and the U.S.'s response, bipartisan in Congress, right? The congressional Republicans that headed Congress at that time, and also President Obama, created a financial control board that has the power over the local budget, and also has a power, and this was also recently validated by federal courts, to overturn any local laws that contradict its mission to get Puerto Rico to pay its debt. All the members of that board are appointed by Congress, by both parties, none of which are voted for directly or indirectly by the people of Puerto Rico, because the people in Puerto Rico don't have voting representation in Congress, or can't vote for the president, right? If that doesn't seem blatantly colonial to you, I don't know what is blatantly colonial. Puerto Rico is in some serious financial debt compared to other U.S. jurisdictions. And the bitter medicine that the Financial Control Board is imposing in order for bondholders to extract as much of that debt as possible is destroying Puerto Rico. It is exacerbating an economic depression that has been going on for over 10 years. That's what a depression means, a recession over 10 years or plus. Puerto Ricans, by the way, are in an extremely precarious economic position, both in the island and the U.S., even though Puerto Ricans are the only Latinos or Latin American immigrants that come with citizenship. They are among the poorest. Another consequence, and this is all, there's like multiple feedback loops between these factors. factors, right? One thing reinforces the other. Crumbling infrastructure. We've heard the damages caused by Hurricane Maria, but the infrastructure was already bad because of the economic crisis and the debt. This is the lower right. This is a power station that literally burned the other day. And this is very recently, and there was an island-wide power outage for over a day. In terms of Maria, if you can imagine what it's like to be without power for 11 months, there were people in Puerto Rico that were without power for up to 11 months. Maria created enormous destruction, both in terms of infrastructure, property, harvest, agricultural harvest, even though agriculture is not very large in Puerto Rico, and most importantly, human life. It took a humongous toll. By the way, it's forecast that hurricanes are going to become more frequent and stronger in the Anthropocene. So what we're seeing now is going to become more frequent in Puerto Rico. There's also massive government corruption and cynicism, and also protests. These are historic protests that happened 3 years ago against the corruption and just the cynical attitude of the local governor at that time. By the way, the current governor is from the same party as that governor. This is news from this week. 9th mayor in Puerto Rico this year accused of corruption by the federal authorities. So another consequence is that we have a new wave of settler colonization by way of tax incentives for wealthy U.S. mainlanders and foreigners. Puerto Rico has had, it's the oldest colony in the world, 1493 to today, and it has had different waves of settler colonization. Many of my ancestors come from the mid to late 19th century. There were all kinds of incentives for European immigrants to come to the island and become wealthier than the local population. And it seems like these patterns of developing the Puerto Rican economy keep repeating themselves, because now we have these humongous tax incentives for wealthy, mainly U.S. Americans that nobody locally in Puerto Rico can take advantage of. It's creating a situation where there's thousands upon thousands of expats that are relocating to Puerto Rico. They pay zero taxes, basically. The law is more complicated than that. They're also buying up a huge amount of land and properties, developing them for tourism, a lot of Airbnb, hotel type of stuff. There's a lot of cryptocurrency investment in Puerto Rico with all the volatility and shadiness that comes with. And that, of course, is pushing people out. So we have an unprecedented level of emigration, an exodus really of people, and the drain that puts on the labor economy. So these are all problems that compound each other. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jade.
So I just want to say, thank you. It was really great to hear from the first presentation and to be invited to speak in this context about law, the borderlands, art, and the Caribe, and Puerto Rico specifically, right? All of those kind of different nodes that my work and my interests touch on in different ways. There's a lot of stuff. There's some things that came up listening to the two previous presentations, but a lot of what I spend my time thinking about, particularly as it pertains to Puerto Rico, is how artists and activists and community members make relation to space and place in a colonial setting, or in a setting where their bodies are not wanted. So not only where their bodies are not wanted, but where they are not being able to enact a relationship to this land. And so I was taken by the prompt to think about, this art and law, and thinking about art in Puerto Rico. So I will just say that I'm a lot of what I've done my writing and thinking about and practice is through bomba, Afro-Puerto Rican bomba music and dance, and the bombas bate as a way to claim space, create relation to land, to history, to each other, turn inwards to a community as opposed to constantly be asking outwards over and over again from a government that is not going to value you or validate you or give you what you need. But I'm not going to talk about bomba today because I think about that a lot, but there are a lot of other practices that are in conversation with this tradition, this oldest music and dance tradition from Puerto Rico, that I think inspire me. And I just basically want to share with you some of these artists that I'm inspired by. But I also want to underscore something about the sort of arts making scene and the performance scene in Puerto Rico in recent years. Because in Puerto Rico, as this colony, art has traditionally followed this very Eurocentric, nationalist, extremely heteropatriarchal patriarchal model that centers middle and upper class, whiter Boricuas, and respectability in many ways as a way to merit and justify this kind of like, look, we're not this bad, we're not these colonized people. We are respectable. We are worthy, right? And so art making has circulated around this discourse, even if it's around critiquing colonialism, right? Well, what's been happening more recently is that as the Puerto Rican left is fragmented, right? In the sense of this, the Puerto Rican left has historically been very masculinist, has historically been very, has had all kinds of issues with class, has been very anti-Black, so as all of these other issues erupt in the Puerto Rican left and kind of demanding attention to other local issues, intersectional issues, disaggregating these Boricua subalterneities, art, right, and art making and artivism has begun to connect these dots, right, between this permanent state, as Jose was saying, of this constitutional legal exception and this ideological gaslighting. And so if it is so I want to thank the California law and arts, the advocacy that happens there, because it's a really important tool for artists, especially because we're often talking about, who owns the art, right? Who has rights to something, particularly because it's turned into a commodity, right? And it is attached to labor. But when you don't have, in historically in a place where people haven't owned themselves and people don't own their relationship to their land, what does this mean, right? What is the function of the law in terms of art making? And if in some ways, if the law's purpose is to uphold the values of the nation state, right, the supposed social contract that is actualized in the context of the specific colonial border space of Puerto Rico, how do you reinvent these other social contracts, right? How do we reinvent other ways of protocol, right? What we know from Indigenous studies folks that have clearly articulated what is protocol as opposed to law, right? And I think that a lot of the artists that are emerging in recent years, and not just emerging, there's artists that have been around for a long time, right? But they're finally getting the recognition that they've deserved. This year, we have elders that have been recognized by the Whitney Biennial or the MacArthur Genius Awards but they've been doing the work for decades, right? But part of this emergence is about bringing into focus a different kind of social contract. And in fact, turning away from the state and turning away from the Puerto Rican state and the U.S. colonial state to rethink what it means to make life and make relation to place. And, and I also I'm interested also, I'm going to talk about other artists, but I'm interested also in pop culture. I'm interested in the phenomenon that is Bad Bunny, right? The most popular musician in the world right now that comes from Puerto Rico. And in his, one of the biggest songs is talking precisely about this issue that Jose was underscoring there about the gentrification in Puerto Rico, right? Esta es mi tierra, este es mi sol, que se vayan ellos, let them leave. I want to stay. This is my land. This is my son, right? Again, articulating this relationship to that place. And also in the kind of one of the many gestures that Bad Bunny is doing in making in this music is also a relationship, a reach towards La República Dominicana, right? Is, through Dominican music, but also, which is newer in this generation, right? A kind of a different relationship to Dominicanness and critical stance, right? And articulation of this hermandad and porousness that 20 years ago was perhaps met with a great deal more racism and division. Not to say that it's not there, but just to note that gestures are happening. So one of the places that arts in Puerto Rico are perennially unfunded, underfunded, and part of the issue with the debt crisis is that all access to public programs are just slashed. And nonetheless, you have this explosion and this work that happens outside of these officially sanctioned spaces, even as it also happens in relationship to these officially sanctioned spaces. One of the moments when that was very apparent was in 2019 with the protest, the Renuncia protest to oust the governor of Puerto Rico, when all languages were put to use, right? All expressive languages, all bodies were put into space, right? It was a movement that cut across different political differences, social classes, intra-island regions. You had an explosion of people trying to find different ways to put their bodies into the space, put their bodies and use their bodies as protests, and use their bodies as protests in the name of a greater Puerto Rico, right? Of uplifting something, not just removing this governor, right? The governor was being asked to leave because he had disrespected so deeply and fundamentally disrespected the Puerto Rican people. Some in the form of kayaks, the motorcycles, the dancing, the perreo intenso on the steps of the cathedral, music, whether in the form of rock bands, plena, bomba, Ricky Martin on floats as a carnival, the resignification of the space and of the objects of Puerto Rican life, horses, of course, tons of street theater, but what is and then also all spaces were put to use, even the water, right? Even the water itself. So thinking about the water as borderlands, how does the water then become, and in relation to the water, become part of articulating this relation to place? As one protesting diver wrote, not even the fish want him, right? And there was also, there was tons of witty signs and the complex body painting, right? What I want to emphasize about this, well, a couple of things. First of all, there were a lot of activists that had been working to, even though this was this organic eruption, there were a lot of activists that had been working for a long time to generate a lot of the kind of base for this movement. But at the same time, there were deeply entrenched artistic practices that were part of the marrow from which that people had to draw from when this moment of protest came about, right? So it wasn't that people were like turning into artists. No, people already had music practices, already had a rich set of embodied practices, specifically embodied practices, and that they were quickly able to put them into use in a way that was attuned to and critical of the contemporary politics of that moment. So I just want to point to some of so this is Nivia Pastrana, this is her project about los presidentes, which is, if you've ever been to Viejo San Juan, entering Viejo San Juan, there's this row of 8 statues of the 8 presidents that visited Puerto Rico or stepped on the island of Puerto Rico during the presidency, maybe for a couple of hours, maybe for longer. And the question remains, like, will Trump get one? And so Nivia Pastrana engages in what she calls body vandalism. And this is like a tourist attraction. People get out and there's all this reverence around them. There's like a policeman that is constantly like surveilling and overlooking the presidents until the sun goes down. They're shined, they're cleaned. Nivia Pastrana, who is an experimental artist, engages in what she calls this body vandalism or perreando con los presidentes. And yes, this is a copyrighted photograph. And speaking of art and law, and this is just to show you some of her work. Please look her up, Nivia Pastrana. So really kind of, through placing her body against these cold metal figures of white American masculinity, she defines them on her own terms, right? And resignifies her colonized, sexualized body in relationship to them. Is my favorite. So that's Nivia Pastrana. There's also Noemí Segarra, whose project Piso Proyecto, which is playing with the idea of piso as both like the floor and piso that I step on, I step down upon with weight and force, and who part of her exploration was to create this portable, movable piso, the platform that she would take to different places spaces and engage in improvisational experimental performance, community-based performance, ultimately interrogating displacement through her own body, right? So what does it mean to be displaced, and what does it mean to try to move, take un piso contigo, right? What does it mean to try to make relation through that forceful stepping on a piece of land that is constantly moving under your feet? And so she tried, and the project was really about the creation of meeting and entry points, right? What does it mean to create this space? And then what does it mean to, in different places, and to bring the different people from those places into that space? And this makes me think a lot also about her work also engages or reflects a lot of the logic of bombas bate, right? This kind of portable, this interlocking structure that then, creates a whole new set of relations in a new place every time that it is moved there. And it also was really important in terms of thinking about and generating work from Erimael Delgado Reyes, who was part of the project for a long time, who has now started the first Vogue ballroom dancing scene, and the idea of the dance floor, right? So what does it mean to take that space? And what does it mean to lie on the floor? And what does it mean to go down to the floor? So there's a lot of really productive and fascinating work that's happening there, although she says that she learned to get el piso vive dentro de ella. So she stopped using the floor itself and instead started thinking about the floor metaphorically. And I think that this is an interesting way that we can think about kind of like internalized borders, etc. Las nietas de Nono are two sisters, Lidela and Michelle Nono, from Rio San Anton in Ponce, which is a working class and partly rural neighborhood that has a lot of kind of historic and cultural myths and stories attached to it, we'll say. So they started what was called patio taller, in the patio workshop in the backyard of their grandmother's house. And their intent was to sort of re-signify what it means to live in these sort of less desirable areas, as well as to also explore their own family history, their own, one of their first pieces was about them discovering kind of simultaneously and discussing simultaneously their own individual experiences of visiting family members in prison family members in Guayama. And so, so part of their project is also about Black masculinity and imprisonment and, what does a life look like outside of it? So one of their first to their earlier work, they would invite people to this patio taller and people would say, oh, where is this? Ay, no, me van a saltar aquí. This is not safe. What am I doing? But again, having them part of what the project was overall was not just to consume this product, but was also to re-choreograph people's relationship to space and these particular histories. And then also Leo Villahermosa, who is perhaps most well known for his work as a bomba dancer and as a kind of pioneer in terms of being a male dancer to really dominate the use of the skirt, not just to use a skirt, but to really beautifully don the skirt and articulate the skirt in bomba dancing, but also is a conceptual artist, a visual artist, and a conceptual artist. And this is from a recent work in progress called Medianías, which is thinking about betweenness, which is thinking about both in terms of gender in betweenness, but also space in betweenness. And like Noemi, Leo has centered a lot of his work in the Santurce area, an area especially around the Calle Loíza, where that is rapidly being gentrified. And part of the project to recuperate the La Escuela Goico that's been turned into an abandoned school that's been turned into a cultural arts center. And the abandoned schools thing is a really big issue because part of the kind of dismantling of the infrastructure has been all this hundreds of schools, like close to 200 schools have been shut down recently. So this leave a big hole in the education system, but then there are these spaces, right, that are kind of like these ghost towns. The first slide is from Colectivo Moribibi, and Moribibi is a word that refers to this plant. It's called, I think, the sensitive plant in English. Basically, it closes up and then it opens up again, right? So it dies and then it muere y revive. But Moribibi is a women's artist collective that mostly was in the form of murals all throughout the island, and it has a deeply educational component to it. I also want to celebrate the work of, there's not a slide for this, but maybe we'll end with her, but Gisela Rosario Ramos, otherwise known as Macha Colón, who is a musician and a film artist, and she made a film about Leo Villahermosa called El Hijo de Rubí. She also has an incredible film called Perfume de Gardenias. But besides that, she is a musician. And I'm going to actually just close with that video because visual art is part of it too, right? Is part of this kind of moving into the public space and sort of activating this collective and collaborative spirit in a way that model what a future could look like.
I'm gonna pause it there or leave it there. So haya means that feeling when you feel good in yourself to be found. All right, so let's just leave it there.
Thank you so much to all of you for your presentations tonight. I think that I mentioned before we began the panel that each year we focus on the geopolitical context of Tijuana and San Diego, but each year we also strive to just feature another part of the world or a part that we don't usually think about as borders, or people think about like a wall as what that looks like. So I really love this concept that you introduced, Sheresade, of the liquid border or the liquid walls. I thought that was like really powerful to think about the context of the Caribbean and the context of migration there, and how water can be both life and this also destructive force within just the way that people relate, that people have to navigate. So let me see, I think there's a question. Can you talk more about water as border? That is something that many of the speakers spoke about.
First of all, I had to say, I enjoy so much Jose's presentation and Jay's presentation. I just feel that this kind of conversation, I wish we could have more, because now I feel that I have to connect with both of them because there is so many things in common and things that, like how talking about frontiers, it's like we see things, and we collect data differently, yet it's the same inspiration, talking about the distances. For example, when you were showing the water frontier between Punta Cana, and Rincon, it's something that we always talk about, like why they go the other, north to go to the other part of Puerto Rico. But my point is, it is like, it's this whole concept of how we perceive these divisions. Is maybe if we cross this way, it's going to be less police, it's going to be less military presence, and that whole thing, takes me to the conversation of the relationship between the people from the islands that are so close. In my case, I am Cuban, Puerto Rican, but Dominican. And I do have my connection with Haiti for sure. But what Jay was talking about, the way this territory and even the performance of the woman that talks about el piso, the floor, it's like, where are we? Where is this land that is really always moving? And how we perceive people that are same people is all by the bombardment of politics. How we are, we bombarded by all this information. And even when we don't believe in this colonization and this idea of law and order, we bombarded so much that it's hard to take off that jacket, So it is super interesting to see how we kind of, like, three of us, we kind of tackle that in different ways. And then, and I'm going to go back to the way that I see the frontiers, because that is a frontier that to me is higher than the problems that people have to deal with the Canal de la Mona, because they're more physical, something that we understand, this idea of like, we need floaties, we need safety gadgets to be able to cross it, and how we understand that even when these waters are a frontier, they also are a via. This is a way for us to say, what is over there? We are connected, we're going to connect. And that is why I always talk about, and I create and I invent these bridges, the bridges that float in between the islands to create this enormous, continent. This archipelago is not an archipelago, it's a continent that gets together. And the proof that I am, right, it is that when we're talking about all this, like the music, when we talk about the plena and the bomba and the music in the bateis, this is something that are these cultural, common denominators that doesn't matter that we have to cross a water. We are still connected by this music, by this language, by this preoccupation and this solidarity.
Thank you.
I hope I answered that question. I went all over, but I think I did.
Oh, that's good. Thank you so much. Jade, Jose, did you want to add anything to that, or I can just go on to we can wrap with the next question?
I could just add very quickly that, if you think of time and place and space in terms of how we imagine ourselves, the idea of Puerto Ricanness is very recent. The idea of a border west of Puerto Rico is very recent. Most of the human history in those islands, our indigenous ancestors, they did not think of space and land versus water that way. For example, in archaeology, there's much closer material cultural correspondence between the east of Hispaniola and the west of Puerto Rico than the west of Puerto Rico and the east of Puerto Rico. Because for people, it was much easier to travel in canoes across water, which our indigenous ancestors were very good at, like Polynesian peoples. They were masters at navigating the ocean. It was much easier for them to go back and forth between Punta Cana and Rincon than to go all the way to where now is San Juan and all that. It's much further away. So we have to also be very mindful of the kind of blinders that this idea of nation state, of nation state borders, right? The blinders that they put on us, because the reality on the ground has always been much more complicated, much more fluid. And to this day, I didn't mention this, but there's actually been emigration now of Boricuas to DR because the economy in DR was doing better. And there's a lot of people in Rincon, for example, where Jade's from, that go back and forth between living in DR and living in Rincon. And they have families on both sides of that divide, So, and yeah, that's human beings. We've always been like that.
In transit.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jose. And I think that we'll wrap with part of his question, just for the interest of time. So we have a beautiful 3-part question, but we can only have time for part of it. Sorry. What does climate change / climate disasters like hurricanes do to the understanding of border crossing between DR and PR? And if you want to touch maybe on the ways that movements or organizers are responding or preparing for future disasters.
That's such a huge question and such a good question that I don't feel entirely prepared to answer. But I do think that there is a lot of work and thinking currently in the Caribe, particularly the quote about the fish even want him gone, right? That this idea that the sea and that the erosion of the coast is also the erosion of the border. I mean, in some ways, right? And so that it is what will wash away some of the destruction wrought by that. It is what will wash away the fancy condos on the waterfronts. And so in some ways it is its own, self-destruction in that way. But in terms of the migration that happens between the west coast of Puerto Rico and the DR and climate catastrophe, well, obviously, people move because of disasters, right? Move because of these crises. And that is part of what drives the movement itself to begin with, and not just to this very close location. But I will say that, quizás Jose, tú puedes hablar, maybe you can talk also about Isabel's work, which I think
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, which I think is a really vital part of the conversation, sort of thinking about, to Jose's earlier point about thinking about the sort of archipelagic inter-island, sort of historic movement, and also in relationship to the edges of the land, right? So quizás tú quieras hablar de eso, Jose.
Very quickly, we have a colleague here at UCSD who's Boricua. She's a badass archaeologist, and she's actually, she's a geoarchaeologist, so she studies geology too, and she partly teaches at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, which is one of the premier institutions of climate change research in the US. The reason why she does that is because she actually studies human adaptations to changing climates in the north coast of Puerto Rico in a longitudinal perspective. So over not decades or centuries, but over thousands of years, right? So she actually digs up indigenous villages that have been buried, with time. And she tries to ascertain how people in prior eras lived in relation to the changing coastline, in relation to the dunes. But she also involves local community in doing that. And there's an element of habitat restoration because it's the north coast of Puerto Rico, which is the Atlantic coast. It's much rougher ocean. That coast naturally had a lot of dunes that have been removed by development. So when they excavate, they also do dune restoration, and they involve local communities in dune restoration. And it's a beautiful kind of merging and synergy between these things that are happening more frequently in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of autonomous local community organizing that is partly the product of the cynicism of any government doing anything. And the hurricane proved that, So people say, screw the government, screw the feds. We're going to take care of this ourselves, right? So there's a lot of that. And I suspect that there's going to be a lot more of it in relation to climate change because of the seriousness of that for islands. But I maybe I'm being too optimistic. I really hope that out of that comes a new archipelagic consciousness that really kind of changes the way that these nation state concepts put blinders around our imagination of self and our imagination of community and just, who we need to listen to and talk to and do things with, and care about. I really do think that climate change is going to do that because it's such a global thing that does not care about borders. It will melt the borders away.
Thank you so much, Faye. And that is all the time we have, but I just wanted to again thank everyone for joining this evening, to Sherizade, Jose, Jay, to our interpreters, Leah and Alexia, to Vanessa. Once again, thank you to our presenters for your insight. Have a good night, everyone.